Good morning. Happy Memorial Day, everyone. Well, tomorrow. It is good to see you all and great to be with you. If we haven't met, my name is Hannah Tom, and I am the new lead pastor here at Denver Community Church. Thank you. If you have not been with us over the last 16 months, we have been through a leadership transition, which will officially commence next week. And as I'm thinking about this new journey that we are about to embark on as a community, I think it makes sense for us to take some time to think about who we are, who we've always been, and who we hope to continue to be as we transition into this next leg of our journey. Socrates made famous the statement, "Know thyself," a statement that would later be inscribed on the Temple of Apollo. And while he didn't coin this phrase, he thought that some self-reflection, some knowing oneself, some opportunities for self-critique were foundational for living a wise life. He thought that this was essential to living an integrous life. He also later said, the unexamined life is not worth living at all. And research has found that Socrates and those who went before him may have been onto something. In the Journal of Positive Psychology, research showed that those folks who are more self-reflective live happier lives, more fulfilled lives. And what we know from spiritual context is leaders who are more self-reflective, leaders who take the chance to think about their blind spots and think about themselves are less likely to have moral failures, burnout, and their organizations are more successful at continuing their missions. And this isn't just true at an individual level. Harvard's Kennedy School of Adaptive Leadership found that organizations that do this work, organizations that take time to reflect on who they are organizations that thrive in change and also are more successful at keeping with their mission. So before we ask, where are we going? What is the next thing for DCC? I want us to take time to ask, who are we? What is the character of this place that so many of us have come to call home? And over the last couple months, I've spent some time listening to stories of those of you who have come before me, those of you who maybe just showed up at DCC and this is a fresh experience for you. And I've taken some time to think about my own journey with this church. And one thing that started to crystallize for me about who DCC is at her core is that we are a distinctly Christian community. Now, some of you might be shifting in your seats a little bit. You might be thinking, that was a really harsh way to say that we're Christian. It felt eerily familiar, maybe, to some experiences you've had in our wider faith family that told you who was in and who was out. So maybe, even if you're like, hey, I'm totally comfortable calling myself a Christian, I'm totally comfortable calling this place a Christian church, maybe calling it a distinctly Christian one was a little too much. And again, for others of you, I heard a little woo in there. Some of you are like, oh, that is so comforting. It's so comforting that we can just say, we are a Christian church. We are a church that is pursuing the way of Jesus. This is who we've always been, and it's who we're going to be in the future. Wherever you're sitting today, I want to make clear one thing. When I say distinctly Christian, what I don't mean is that I'm tinkering around to write out a belief statement or a list of things that make us distinctly Christian that you'll find on a new beliefs page that we're rolling out on our website. I don't mean that. I don't think that being distinctly Christian means we believe all of the right things. There's not going to be a list of things that determine whether you're in or out. You won't see that page on our website. Because I think being distinctly Christian is something different altogether. I think being distinctly Christian is about being part of a community that's always asking the question, who is God? And specifically, who is Jesus? And what is he actually like? I think it's part of being a community that takes seriously our ancient texts and is willing to be surprised by them. Do you know what I think the biggest problem is with rolling out a beliefs page? Because I found that this text actually surprises me often. When I start digging into the scriptures, what I have found in my Christian journey is that most of the time, Jesus is actually way better than I thought he was. I don't think I could write a list of beliefs that make us Christian that would do justice to who Jesus is and what it is like to pursue his life. So instead, when I say we're distinctly Christian, I mean we're going to continue to be curious. We're going to continue to ask hard questions. We're going to continue to center ourselves on scriptures that tell Jesus' story. We're going to continue to explore and participate. And this morning, we're going to continue in the book of Hebrews. Now, Hebrews is a really interesting book in our scriptures for a couple of reasons. One, Hebrews is interesting because we don't know who wrote it. For a long time, we thought we did. We thought that Paul was the author of Hebrews. But as scholars started to dig through this book, a couple of problems became very apparent. First, Paul never says that he wrote Hebrews. And I don't know if you've noticed from your Bibles, but Paul's the kind of guy where if he wrote something, he wants you to know. And he doesn't say that in the book of Hebrews. The other thing is every preacher has a little bit of a theological calling card. We might say that what you'll find about preachers is that all of us have about one really good sermon. That sermon is the thing, and I mean that sincerely. We all have just one. It's that thing we come back to time and time again. It's our part of the story that Jesus has entrusted us with to carry forward. And Paul, too, was not exempt from having this theological calling card. So as scholars are looking at the book of Hebrews, they start going, it doesn't quite sound exactly like Paul. There's different themes presented in there. There's different things that this author wants to talk about. And as those scholars who are very interested in linguistics or the study of language started to look at the book of Hebrews, they realized that this text also isn't written in Paul's typical style. We all kind of have this way that we talk or write, that we can be identified. I think personally of a story when Patrick and I were first married, and we were driving somewhere. I'm in the driver's seat, so I asked him to send a text message on my behalf. And I dictate this message to him, and he writes it out faithfully. But then he looks at me with a look that I can only describe as something like horror. And he says, "You're not even going to include a smiley face?" Look, I'm a get-to-the-point kind of girl. If you ever get a text message from me with no fewer than 5 emojis, which my husband assures me would make me much more likable, I probably didn't write that text. On the flip side, when I write text messages for Patrick, he is sure to tell me where all the hearts, stars, rainbows, and smiley faces belong. We all have a style in which we communicate things, and Hebrews is just not in Paul's style. And maybe the most convincing reason that we don't think that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews is because in Hebrews 2, the author tells us how they came to faith through the message of somebody else's direct encounter with Jesus. But what we know from the book of Acts and from Paul's letters is that Paul tells a story of coming to Jesus from this divine encounter, being stopped on the road from Jesus himself, and that's how he came to know the gospel. So, with great confidence, scholars believe that Paul did not write this letter. Now, some have suggested Apollo, who was an Alexandrian preacher, and that would explain why Hebrews has a very polished Greek to it, so that's an option. Some have said Barnabas, who was a contemporary of Paul and had a Jewish background, which would explain why Hebrews has this very clear Jewish theological story included within it. And other folks in the 20th and 21st century have suggested that Priscilla may have actually been the author of the book of Hebrews, which is interesting. And the reason, or one of the reasons, that folks argue that Priscilla may have written this book is because it's anonymous. As a woman writing in a patriarchal society, it would make sense that she would have left her name off of it. Now, these are all interesting options, but at the end of the day, we actually don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews. What we do know is that this book was likely written to a group of Christians who were starting to feel a little disillusioned about the faith. They're writing probably around the year 60 or 70 under the Emperor Nero, who you might recall had a special disdain for Christians because they would not worship him. So Christians are living at a time when it is particularly costly to be a Christian. To add to that, their expectation from the onset was that Jesus was coming back soon. Now, around the 60s and 70s, it might be starting to be clear that maybe that wasn't as quickly as we had anticipated. So why stay Christian? Why not go back to a faith that was a little easier, a little more socially acceptable? That's what the author of Hebrews is addressing. And Hebrews 11, where we'll be today, is often called the Hall of Faith. In Hebrews 11, our author takes us through all of those who have followed God, asking questions like, who is God and what are they really like from the very beginning? And that's where we're going to pick up our text. We're going to pick up after we've gone through this Hall of Faith, and this is what our author tells us. We're going to be in Hebrews 11. I'll start in verse 39 and work our way through 12:3. If you don't have a Bible with you, there will be one underneath the seat in front of you or around you, and those page numbers on the screen behind me are going to correspond to those Bibles. Hebrews 11, starting at 39, says this: "These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." Now, when I read this text, when I hear that we're being made perfect, my gut reaction is to think about me as an individual Christian, to think about my own sanctification process. And the reason for this is probably because of theologians like John Wesley, who would lay the groundwork for movements like the holiness movement, which, if you're not familiar, the holiness movement says that actually if we all pursue Jesus enough, if we are open enough to Jesus' transforming power, we too can be perfect like Jesus. We can be sinless, and that's the goal of Christian faith. But actually, in the context of texts like this one, it doesn't actually seem like our author is talking about an individual Christian. See, our author includes a long history of those who have been in the faith. And our author includes those people who got it really right, and also includes those that are a little embarrassing. If this is a family photo, the author didn't have the foresight to place a few people on the end that they wanted to crop out later. We have in this story characters like Abraham, full of faith. We have characters like Joseph, full of vision. But we also have characters like Samson, who I think was the ancient version of a meathead who could not handle his anger. We also have Barak, who was a really hesitant leader. And most disturbingly to me, we also have people like Jephthah, which, if you remember Jephthah's story, he actually sacrificed his daughter because he believed after a military victory that our God required the same kind of sacrifice as those pagan gods. Jephthah got it terribly wrong. And even some of those people were pretty proud of. Like, I think of David. But actually, if we study that story of Bathsheba, at its best, David was an adulterer. At its worst, David was more of a predator. So we have all these people in the faith that actually are really messy. Moses the murderer, Paul too. We have that character in the letter to the Corinthians where we find out that one of the church members actually took up with his stepmother. We also have that story about Barnabas and Paul getting so upset with each other that they split ways and don't come back together. It's moments like these in our text that make me start to read the Bible a little bit different than I was taught. I always thought in Sunday school with the flannel graphs that each of those people we were putting up was a picture of somebody I was trying to be like. That we had heroes and heroines in our faith that are somehow better or more qualified than you and I in this room to be like Jesus. But when we look at their stories, that doesn't actually seem to be the case. That word perfect, teleos, which means something more like maturity. Actually, in Hebrews 5 in our English Bibles, we do translate that word as maturity rather than perfection. I think that's more what we're being called to. And not you and I as individual people, but us as a community are being called to a teleos, to a maturity, to being part of the end goal. We get a leg of the race in which we are trying to pursue not our own perfection, but the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, which is Jesus. And sometimes that comes with surprises when we open our text. Sometimes Jesus is actually better than we imagined him to be. If we were going to continue this hall of faith in our own time, we would bump up against people like Constantine, who the emperor in 313 legalized Christianity. For better, or as most historians will argue, for worse for the faith. We'll bump up against people like Augustine and Athanasius, and while we still read their theologies, and they're incredibly helpful as they make love the center point, where they ask theological questions always with the root question of how is this loving God and how is this loving my neighbor? Or for Athanasius, he talks about the Trinity. He helped us form our theology and understanding around the Trinity. That's all wonderful. And if you kept reading their work, you would also find that they undergirded patriarchy. If you continued on from there, you'd find characters like Martin Luther. And while Martin Luther and the Reformation certainly made a massive impact on our faith, it took the scriptures from the halls of clergy and gave it back to the common man so that we could all wrestle with this text. Martin Luther also left us with a body of work that's incredibly anti-Semitic, and now we have to deal with that. We'd also come across characters like John Calvin, who, while he had a certain knack for bringing together a community of Christ followers, he also ruled that group of people more like a dictator than a wise pastor. There's a lot that we would have to wrestle with. There's a lot we'd have to contend with. And surely we would also come across people like Mother Teresa and C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Day, those characters we're actually incredibly proud of. And we'd also come across ourselves. We'd also have to do the kind of self-reflection that's easy to do when we're looking at our past and those who have gone before us and saying they should have done X, Y, and Z, and how unfortunate that they missed A, B, and C. But we'd also have to look at you and me. We'd have to be really honest about ourselves. Richard Rohr talks about this in Following Up where he talks about the ego needing to die so that the soul can really live. Part of what it means to be distinctly Christian is being incredibly honest about the ways that we have failed to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, and to trust that God will use that anyways. When I think about characters like David, who obviously had some major failures, but our text says that David was a man after God's own heart. I always thought, reading through this hero's lens, that meant something like David had a heart that was more like God than mine. But actually, I wonder if when we say that David was a man after God's own heart, we mean that David was a man in pursuit of God's heart. That David was a man that even when he got it wrong, brought himself back to asking the questions, what is God really like? And what does that mean for me? What if we could be that kind of community? The kind that doesn't buy into things like cancel culture, because frankly, if we had had these Bible characters, those who have been the foundation of our faith, I don't think any of them would have made it through our modern scrutiny. What if the church is actually a place where it's safe to fail? What if we stop expecting people to be the pioneers and perfecters of our faith and started realizing that that is too much for us? That what we are called to is something more like pursuit than perfection, more like a persevering. And that this race that we're running, we're not running as individual athletes. We're in something more like a relay. And all along the way, we're asking, who is Jesus? What is he really like? And we're wrestling with this. Here at DCC, we talk about exploring and participating in the life of Christ. Sometimes as Christians, or at least for me, I'm tempted to only explore. I'm tempted to construct a really pretty theology about all the things that I think about Jesus. Sometimes I think that's much easier. It takes out a little bit of the do-it-scared method of Christianity, because the truth is, you and I will all fail. And that's okay. Grace doesn't call us to gloss over those failures. Grace calls us to work justice from the inside out. Those failures are an opportunity for us to shave off those parts that don't look like Jesus yet. It's part of our maturing process. Not perfecting, but maturing. Have you ever met somebody who's incredibly mature? Their ability to apologize, their ability to reflect on the things that they've gotten wrong is incredible. I think sometimes the church has lost a little bit of that. We've lost a little bit of the maturity to identify where we've gotten it wrong and then persevere with people as we redeem that. Because Jesus doesn't cancel people, he calls them. We need to look like that if we're going to pursue the way of Jesus. We need to not cancel people. We need to call them into a better way. We need to walk with them through the ugly parts of the faith journey that we're not super proud of, the parts that are hard and messy. We need to be committed to this perseverance, not a perfection. I think that's what Hebrews calls us to. It calls us to be the kind of people who get in the messy, who are okay with the messy. The kind of people who say to one another, I know Christ has called you to be this. I know right now you feel like you haven't hit that. You've missed the mark. You wish you were on the end of the photo and could be cropped out. But actually, God is still doing a redemptive work. Here at DCC, we're going to continue to be the kinds of people who explore the text in such a way that surprises us, where we find that Jesus actually is better than we thought he was. And we're also going to be the kind of people who continue to participate in this work. We're going to be like those followers in the book of Hebrews who apparently did persevere because you and I are sitting here today. Those followers that, though the author was a little harsh with them, calling them immature, apparently continued in their maturity. Apparently passed off the baton to the next folks who didn't do it perfectly, but did it with perseverance. And so on and so forth. And we're going to take the foundation of those who went before us. We're going to be self-reflective. And we're also going to continue to pursue Jesus at the center of the story, because the truth is the only perfect one is him. Let's pray. God, I thank you that we have been called, that we've been invited into exploring who you are, what you're really like, and that, God, you always are sanctifying us. You always are maturing us as individuals and as a community. God, we may not know exactly where DCC is headed as our next thing, but what we do know is the character that you've built in us, that you have always been building us to be a community of people after your heart, a community of people not concerned with getting it perfect, but persevering until the end. Amen. We're going to head into the Eucharist. And one of the things we say at DCC, in light of the fact that none of us are perfect, is this isn't our table. There's no lines around who's invited or who's not. You don't have to be a member of this church to participate in Eucharist with us. At the end of the day, this isn't our table. This is God's table. And the invitation is for anyone who feels called to participate to join us in the Eucharist. When Jesus was with his disciples, he said this: "While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, 'Take and eat. This is my body.' Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins.'" Come as you are led.